One of the most forgotten pilots to have ever flown was Laura Bromwell. Laura was a young farm girl who read about others' flying adventures outside her small hometown and wanted to do it herself. She would break barriers and records along the way, bypassing even some that she had looked up to as her heroes. Laura was born on May 17, 1897 to Leonard and Louisa Lulu Peake Bromwell in the small farming town of Florence, Indiana. She was number 7 of 8 children, but she stood out among her siblings as an adventurer. Her piercing blue eyes and red hair would one day become her trademark. At the age of 12, near her home, along the mighty Ohio River, as the story is told, her dad and her were putting up hay like many do in rural farming communities at the time, when her father fell from the hayloft. He landed on his head and sadly never recovered. Around this time, she would start reading dime store novels of Lincoln Beachey and Art Smith. Lincoln Beachey was known as the man who owns the sky. At the time, he was the foremost exhibitionist flyer. By the time of his death in 1915, nearly 30 million people had seen him fly. Orville Wright once said of him, "An airplane of Lincoln Beachey is poetry." A few years later, Laura found her way to Cincinnati, Ohio, living with an uncle. It was a world away from the small farming community in Indiana, but it provided her the excitement and adventure she craved. Laura would find a job at a restaurant downtown. It wasn't a glorified position, but it was as a cashier, and she was able to talk to the customers and hear their stories. Many were just that. During a shift, she was working, a customer had overheard a story she had jumped nearly 50 feet into a quarry back home growing up. The customer thought this story was crazy. Instead, the customer challenged her to jump off the Roebling suspension bridge in downtown Cincinnati over the Ohio River for $20 if she would do it. Shockingly, she accepted. John A. Roebling, a Prussian engineer, would create the Roebling Suspension Bridge in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio on December 1st, 1866, and at the time it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. Over the years, many jumped from the Roebling Suspension Bridge over the Ohio River. Sadly, many jumped to their deaths. You can do a search online and find evidence of this throughout the history of the bridge. Laura would not be the first to jump from the bridge. Meredith Stanley was the first to do it in 1888. Meredith Stanley was a vaudeville actor that was hugely popular at the time. The drop from the bridge was around 110 feet, depending mostly on the level of the Ohio River. At around 1 p.m. on July 30th, 1916, Laura Bromwell jumped into history. She showed up wearing a one-piece bathing suit with her red hair blowing in the breeze as she made her jump. She jumped and did a somersault in the air, hitting the water feet first. As a Cincinnati newspaper recalled, she swam to the Ohio side, disappointing a number of women who were waiting on the Covington side, ready to offer a dinner in her honor. A boat was there to pick her up and take her back to the Ohio shoreline. One guide described his feelings. When I saw that brave little red-topped head bob safely out of the water and strike for Cincinnati shore, I was not ashamed to say that I cried like a schoolboy. The jump made national news and was even featured in Variety magazine. Laura the Adventurer did not stay in Cincinnati too long, and in 1918 she moved to Virginia. It was here in Virginia in 1918 where a young Laura Bromwell would start selling Liberty Loan war bonds. She sold so many, in fact, that she won a free ride in an airplane. Laura was immediately hooked and began work to get her pilot's license. She poured her heart and soul into her training. Her first foray into flying was the Pan American Games. She didn't disappoint, winning several awards. She once told a newspaper, "I want to be noticed not for what I wear, but for what I do. Dangerous, sure, but if it wasn't dangerous, everybody would be doing it." In 1919, Laura Bromwell joined the New York Police Department when they posted an ad requesting volunteers for an aerial squadron. Laura would become the first female aviator to graduate Aviation Corps School and the first aerial policewoman in the world. And now 21-year-old Miss Bromwell was hailed as the foremost American aviatrix. She was becoming a celebrity even before she had broken records. Part of this was because at the time there were so few women flyers. In the months that followed, Laura set and broke several records. She was continuing to break barriers and the glass ceiling for the next generation. In the big city of New York City, she was far from home, but felt at home because of the support she had from the locals. In 1920, Laura Bromwell would break more ceilings. She would break the world record loop-the-loops with doing 87, and then broke her own record with 199. She would also break the record for speed at 135 miles per hour, which was unheard of then. Ever the showman, after breaking one of these records, she calmly got out of her airplane and borrowed a lady's compact from the crowd and started to powder her own nose. This endeared her to men and women alike. During a flight, Laura had one of her own scares. She had a passenger aboard when her plane caught fire. Laura calmly landed the plane and they both walked away. The plane was destroyed, though. In an interview, she said, "I'm willing to give my whole life to an airplane. I don't want to marry, and I don't want to devote myself to anything else in the world." In another interview, she remarked, "If I ever see that I'm going to smash up at all, I will make for something solid, so I will hit it hard. I don't mind being killed, but I don't want to be crippled. That is all I ask of fate, that when an accident comes, it won't get me halfway." Many women of the day resolved to getting married, having kids, and sitting down as a housewife. Laura was not one of those. She, of course, was an attractive young lady who would have had many suitors, but she remained weary of them. She once commented, "Men are more dangerous than flying." It's unclear how or where she met George Davis. He had to have left an impression, though, on her, because she became smitten with him rather quickly. It didn't take long, and she was engaged to George. George, it is said, worried about her flying, and so she promised him, after they were married, she would quit. He must have really meant something to her for her to give up her first love like that. On June 5th, 1921, Laura Bromwell, at 24 years old, borrowed a Curtiss JN4, or a Jenny as many at the time called it. She was going up to do some loop-the-loops. The crowd loved those. She made her first one with the crowd cheering her on. As she made the second, something went terribly wrong. From the ground, the onlookers spotted what appeared to be Laura coming out of the seat and being loose in her seatbelts. The plane spiraled uncontrollably. With every second, the crowd watched in horror. Many expected to see Laura save it from impending disaster at the last second. It was not to be, sadly, though. The Curtiss airplane slammed into the ground hard. Spectators, police, and Laura's fiancé rushed to the plane. She was pulled out of the twisted wreckage, but sadly, Laura was gone. Around the country, people were in shock to lose another promising aviator. Many of the cities that she had visited mourned her. The cities she called home the last few years turned out to honor her. Nearly 30,000 people lined the streets. Laura's own New York Police Department saw her off. Her body was sent to Toledo, Ohio, where her sisters lived to be buried. It was here that the plans changed and her body was sent home to Florence, Indiana. Thousands of wreaths adored her casket, and an honor guard followed her home. She would be laid to rest in the same fields she once played in as a child. Laura had achieved so much in such little time. There's no question that what she had done broke many barriers for future young women and men alike. There's no gravestone, no markers, and no monuments in Florence Cemetery to show she's at rest there. But that's where Laura is. Her adventures had come to an end, but her next adventure and the next life had just begun, and I'm sure she's flying a plane up there, looking down on us now. Even though I looked, I couldn't find anything else on George Davis and what had happened to him afterwards and where he had went. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.